back to the beginning. Okay, so we are going to start with Africa. Africa is a continent. It is not a country, obviously. It is a very large landmass that has a whole bunch of different populations and cultures in it. It's the same way as both China and India are very large masses with very different cultures that are happening within them. And there are many fascinating artworks and creativities that are coming out of Africa and have been historically made in Africa that we're going to look at starting first. So as this is a three-dimensional design class, a great place to start is sculpture. And there's an incredible tradition of artistry in carved sculptures. And most of these that I'm showing you are not meant as art objects originally. Okay, they have cultural and spiritual purposes that are external to their function as beautiful objects. They are part of cultural history as well, and they have been collected by collectors who think they're amazing to look at, but they also have significance in tribal heritage and in history. You'll look at some of these and see that the colors, because they're derived from organic substances, have this really very pleasing palette. And Africa has a long history of goldsmithing. So again, these overwhelmingly had other purposes besides being interesting designed objects. And they had strong cultural significances. Okay, so creative people, as we know, love to be inspired by things that are beautiful and different to their history and their culture, and they adopt that into their work. Now, Picasso is a fellow who is a very famous French, well, he's Spanish, but he became famous in France, and he was a painter, and he was probably the most famous painter of the 20th century. And he was inspired very much by African masks that he saw. So he took the iconography, so the visual look of these African carvings that he saw, and he incorporated that into his work as a way to abstract the figure. Now, there's nothing wrong with being inspired by other cultures. We live in an amazing multicultural world. The problem is when you do it uncredited, and there are definitely issues of cultural appropriation in Picasso's because he didn't necessarily respect where it came from, and he didn't necessarily try to find out what the original meanings were. The paintings were amazing that came out of it, but he was not culturally sensitive. Okay? Now, this piece called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is a large painting. It's probably about 6 feet high, and it's in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City now. And it is a group of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 women, and they are not mademoiselles, they are demoiselles, which means that they are prostitutes, apparently. And Picasso has directly taken African carved mask iconography and put it on the faces of 2 of these women. Okay, so it's a dynamic, a very influential piece, but it, again, is pretty much undid appropriation of some of the iconography. That is my photograph of the painting in New York City. It is a really dynamic, interesting piece. I mean, it's problematic, but it also is, it's very strong, you know? Okay, so let's take a look at Picasso briefly while we're here. So he came to Paris. He was extremely unsuccessful in the beginning. He was the classic starving artist, and this is reflected in the work from the Blue period. The Picasso Blue period was all about depression and hunger and things not going so well. Okay, he was struggling, and that is reflected in his figures, who are scrawny and sad. You know, there was emotional power to it for sure, but it was not happy work. This is the seamstress, or the laundress. So she's ironing the laundry, and she's not looking too happy about it. Okay, so then, so I got my slides out. I'm still in the Blue period. I think this is called the death or mourning. Like, it was just not a happy time. So then Picasso has a baby with his wife. Well, his wife has the baby, and he starts to sell paintings. And things start looking up, and we move definitely into the Rose period. And the Rose period is when subjects get happier. They get like they have been fed more a little bit, and generally life is looking up for Picasso. It's painting all these acrobats, and things brighten up, which they did in his life as well. It's very much a reflection of what was happening. You can see how the whole color palette has changed. Okay, so I have to go back to one slide, which is his cubism. Now, we've looked at George Braque and the fractional perspective, and Picasso was the other artist involved in the creation of Cubism. There were two of them. So George Braque and Picasso, and they both kind of simultaneously were working on Cubism. George Braque's work never changed that much. It continued within the grays. Picasso did this for a while, and then he went on to other things. So he certainly evolved as an artist. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to get into his classical inspiration. So he starts looking at like Rome and Greece and looking at those romantic profiles and, you know, like the things you would see on a coin, and he puts them into his paintings, like the, you know, or you'd see like an ancient sculpture, right? And the figures become much heavier. Like, he's become very successful now, and everybody's doing well, right? And the visual iconography reflects this. Okay, there we have the cubism, right? It's interesting to see how close his work is with Braque. I have to be careful with my slides to make sure I know, is it a Picasso, is it a Braque? Because they are so similar in this period, right? Then Picasso starts to introduce some of his old iconography back into the work, the minstrels, the color, and it evolves into what we think of as mature Picasso painting. This was actually also inspired by a carving. Like, there's a sculpture that looks like this face that they have found. Okay, so this is mature Picasso. Okay, so he has kept the Cubist idea of looking at things from multiple perspectives, but he has also reintroduced representational forms, like you can tell that these are people. There's a painting called Guernica, and it was based on an incident that happened during the Second World War, where the Nazi army bombed a Spanish village called Guernica basically to the ground and pretty much killed everybody. And this is a very large painting. It's like, I don't know, 15, 16 feet wide. It's huge. And it's about this horrible bombing, right, during war. And Picasso, during the Second World War, stayed in Paris. He did not, like, after, even though the Nazis came in and occupied, he was basically protected because he was a famous artist. He had that kind of, they were not going to disappear him because people knew who he was. And apparently some Nazi officers came into his studio and were looking at the painting, and they said, "Oh, who did this?" He said, "You did." So he was definitely not a pro-Nazi, and he was extremely anti-war in his work, particularly in this painting. Okay, so this is mature Picasso. He's uses a lot of color. He employs the multiple perspectives. We will return to the painting that this is originally based on in a later lecture, but take a look at it because it will come back to you. It's based on a different, older painting, okay, which we will be looking at in a couple of weeks, which may be next week because we're on a condensed schedule. This is his last wife. He had 3 wives. This is Jacqueline, and she's the one basically who really safeguarded the legacy after he died. Okay, so these are the self-portraits. This is young Picasso when he was in the blue period and he was hungry. Then he starts to get more successful. And finally, this is old Picasso portrait. So the evolution of the artist through his own eyes. One of the reasons I put him in here today was because he also did ceramics. He liked painted ceramic objects, and the fact that we are designing dishes right now is, I thought it'd be interesting for you to see how someone who was strictly an artist, he was not a designer per se, would treat a decorative object like a porcelain vase or a plate, because we are designing dishware right now. So this loose painting style, he was a very confident drawer. Like, he was very confident with the brushwork he did, and I think that's something you could definitely learn from him. How to be confident and just use a couple of lines to really communicate something. This, you can see, is based on those old Greek ceramics, the red clay with the black painting on it. So he's used history and created his own modern version of it. There's nothing to say that you can't do 3-dimensional aspects to your work, which students have done. I wish I had more access to the exemplars, because I have a collection of mugs that students have done that were really quite creative and interesting that are locked up at Seneca right now. Okay, now we're going to return to Africa. We are going to go and look at African textiles, and there are several really interesting divergent textile traditions in Africa. The first of these is kente cloth, and it's a type of weaving that is done in strips. So you weave down in strips and then you attach it together. You piece the strips together to make larger fabric. And it is one of the most identifiable forms of African textile and is used in university ceremonies and places where cultural significance is desired. They will many times use kente cloth for those purposes. And you can see how you can see those long strips going down. This type of fabric and weaving originated in Ghana, and we are going to be looking at an artist from Ghana who uses this later on in this lecture. So take a look at this and remember it, because we will be returning to it in another artist's work. This is an example of beadwork weaving. This is a printed textile, but it's basically structured to look like kente cloth. Okay, so the second type of fabric that is very identified with African fashion are these these are some photographs of the 1960s and 1970s, but it's these fabrics that are these batik fabrics that are like, it's a wax resist dye process, and they're very colorful, and they are actually imported. And there's an artist we're going to look at again, so pay attention to these textiles, because another artist we're going to look at, a Nigerian artist, uses these and talks about it in a video that we are going to be watching later. Okay. But you will often find these fabrics used when designers are trying to evoke a certain connection to Africa. Here we have Chanel Iman, who's American, wearing this dress in, I believe this is one of the African Fashion Week fashion shows. Here we have a ball gown made out of that batik textile. Okay, beadwork is another tradition in Africa, and there's a really good site on Google that I'm going to take you to where it goes more in depth about beadwork, but I'm going to show you these images now, and then once the lecture is done, we will look at that, and that link is in your FST 201 links. So here we have the beadwork, and these were not just decorative, they also were used to signify status in society, and also they were a form of personal wealth. Okay. Okay, so this is a modern piece, and it's inspired by beadwork tradition, and it's worn by Yasmin Warsame, who is Somali but lives in Toronto. So she is local, and she is a very successful international model, and we are proud to have her as a resident of Toronto. Okay, another textile from Africa is the mud cloth, and mud cloth uses, the way a batik would use wax as a resist, mud cloth actually uses mud and creates these quite graphic textiles, and has a simplicity and a beauty that continues to inspire designers. And the palette tends to be the color of the cloth, a black or a very dark brown dye, and then these sort of sienna colors. So it has a particular color range as well, as you can see, like that. And here it's been used on a pair of Nikes, and the First Lady is wearing mud cloth here very beautifully. Okay, so here we have a designer, in this case John Galliano for Dior, who is using some of the elements that we've talked about, specifically the beadwork, in a collection that he did for Dior. So the debate about inspiration versus appropriation can go back and forth, and it's certainly one that we can engage in. Absolutely. Okay, so this is a fashion shoot that was styled up, and we talked about styling last week, to kind of evoke some of those studio photographs that I briefly went past earlier from the 1960s and 70s. So it's a modern shoot, but it's been put together to look like almost like you found old photographs from an old photo studio. And this is Leah Kabebe, beautiful model who I always thought was Canadian, and then I found out that she wasn't, but she's still an amazing model in this photo shoot. Okay, so I briefly want to talk about the Ebony Fashion Fair. This was a traveling fashion exhibition, like a show, a beautiful fashion show, and it was put together by the co-founder of the publisher. She's the wife of the publisher of Ebony magazine, but she also was the co-founder of the magazine. And she would go to Paris and buy the most amazing couture and bring it back and put it on in this traveling fashion show with the top black models. This, you can see that it's from 1961, and she wanted to just show elegance, and it was this really successful, interesting traveling fashion show, and it actually was a door opening for some young black models to get into the industry. And it also ended up with this really incredible collection of couture clothing. So one of those models that I think her first gig was the fashion fair was Pat Cleveland, who I'm not sure how she did this, but Pat Cleveland is at the center of every interesting scene in 1970s fashion, right? Like, she was in Paris with Antonio Lopez, the illustrator. She was part of Halston's crew in New York City. I mean, she just was this, she had a wonderful personality. She had a very lively, dancey walk on the runway, and designers just loved her. So she was hugely inspirational and was a part of a lot of the narratives in 1970s fashion. And she's still working even today. This is Grace Jones from Jamaica, who started out as a model and then ended up becoming, obviously, a very successful musical artist. Iman, who is from Somalia, very elegant, also a very famous model in the 1970s and 80s. Okay, this model is named Roshumba. She was working a lot in the 90s, and I just really liked her as a model back then, and I wanted to put her in because I'm not sure if people really remember her. She was just a great model, and I enjoyed always seeing her in magazines. Alec Weck became very successful in the 90s. And of course, Naomi Campbell, who is probably the most successful and visible model in fashion, who's been giving it on the runway nonstop for pretty much 30 years now, which is incredible because models don't normally have careers like that. So good for you, Naomi. Okay, so first artist we're going to look at is Yinka Shonibari, who is British of Nigerian heritage, and his work deals, like, he uses, as you can see, that's him, that's the cloth he's got in his hair. He uses the cloth as a representation of diaspora and history and black culture, as you will see in his sculptures. He also has a disability, so he comes at his work from two different angles, as you will see. Okay, so what he does is he recreates historical dress, but uses these contemporary fabrics that he will go to markets in London and buy, right? These fabrics are, these African fabrics, and he will buy them and make them into like traditional British ensembles. And it's a real interesting comment on history and inclusion. This is an entire Victorian interior that's been recreated in these textiles. He also tends to cut off the heads of his sculptures, as you will see. Okay, so this sculpture, once you take a look at it for a bit, you will realize that you have seen before, okay? You have not seen it as a sculpture, you saw it as a painting, but this is his interpretation of the swing. This one is an interpretation of a classical British portrait of this posh country family. And that's his take on it. It's a really dynamic, interesting sculptural work, as you can see. And for us as designers, a lot of the visual message is communicated through clothing, which I find fascinating. Like the dress history here, I think, is fascinating as well. There's a movie that he made using his sculptural designs. And that is the video we're going to look at after this lecture. Okay, second artist we're going to look at today is El Anatsui, and he is from Ghana. And he is a sculptor who was inspired by kente cloth, as you will see from the images of his work that he's in front of here. And these sculptures that he makes, these wall installations, are very large, shining, metallic, basically large textiles, except that they're made out of metal, okay? And I remember the first time I saw his work, it was at the Armory show in New York City, and it was a sculpture like this that was just traveling down the whole wall. And I thought, wow, I've never seen anything like this before. It was amazing because it was so textile based and it was so sculptural, but it was also like just shiny and seductive. Like he knows his surfaces and his materials really well. And the fascinating thing is it's all made out of old, what do you call it, those bottle caps, you know, and tin cans. Like you can see in this one, you know, those are tin cans that have been flattened, right? So that's where the shiny metal comes from. It comes from this reclaimed material, right? So the color actually comes from the color of the brand. And he has like a whole, you know, crew working on this stuff, putting these together, hammering this together like they were textile, but it is all metal, and it's almost like a form of chainmail. That's the sculpture I saw at the Armory show. That's my photograph, and I loved how he pinned it up in certain places and created this moving, undulating form along the wall. Just as a sculptural object, it was really dynamic. And then when I found out what it was made of, I was like, wow, because it ties into, for me, around issues of sustainability and reuse, and it's just a very interesting sculptural exploration. There was an exhibition of his work at the Royal Ontario Museum a couple of years ago that was fascinating, and they still have one of his sculptures. So if you go up, you will see it. So I think it's on the third floor. Definitely visually dynamic, interesting work. I'm always happy to see his work in a museum. It's like, oh, there, I love that. Okay, so let's go and talk more about current fashion. This is Edward Enninful, and he is currently the editor of British Vogue, and he was brought in and had a long history of styling and being an editor for various magazines, and then he came in and basically revitalized, which was what was a somewhat stodgy magazine. And if you're reading British Vogue now, you can see that it's a lot more inclusive than it used to be, and it's just a lot more dynamic. Like, he's a really interesting visual creative, and he's bringing that to the magazine, so it's definitely worth checking out. Patrick Kelly. Okay, so this man was one of my favorite designers in the 1980s when I was a teenager, and he brought this real spirit of fun and play to his work. And he went to Paris. He's American, and then he went to Paris and brought this American in Paris vibe to everything. And he just was like, he was cool, but he also was, brought this real elegance to his shapes and his designs. And I loved his work. I'm pretty sure that's Rashomba with him, with the bow on her head beside him, in the pink. So he was just really innovative. He was a fantastic designer, and unfortunately, we lost him to AIDS. He was one of the first, that whole first wave of talented gay men that we lost to AIDS, and it just cut an incredible career short, and it was heartbreaking because I would have loved to have seen how he would have evolved. Okay, here we have Jay-Z with Rocawear. The influence of hip hop on fashion has been huge. And there is a documentary that I have queued up. We're going to watch a section of, and it's talking about hip hop influences on fashion because they are massive, right? And they're not always credited. Fat Farm was a brand that brought hip hop style more into the mainstream. Sean John was, of course, Puffy Combs brought in the street looks, but then combined them with all this luxury and fur and textiles and created this really hugely successful menswear line. Virgil Abloh now designs for Vuitton. And of course, Kanye West has had massive success with his fashion. Okay, but I think the most successful crossover from music has definitely been Rihanna. Her Fenty makeup and the Fenty fashion, for me, has been the most, I'd say, well, probably because it's happening right now. It's so present to us. I mean, Kanye certainly as well, but I love the fact that Rihanna uses hugely a wide range of models in her shows, as you can see from the lineup at the end of this collection. Body diversity is very much a part of what she's showing on the runway, and there is this really incredible style about her that she brings to all of her work, and it's really exciting to see what she comes out with every collection.